Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2, all about methods. This chapter introduces terms and methods that's used in sociological research. Additionally, it explains how different methods are used and when, with a specific focus on quantitative and qualitative methods. How researchers collect data and what they collect are covered, and the chapter concludes with an explanation of the ethics used in research.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. Methods. Paradox. If we successfully answer one question, it only spawns others. There is no moment when a social scientist's work is done. The general goal of sociology is to see how our individual lives are intimately related to, and in turn affect, the social forces that exist beyond us. Good sociological research begins with a puzzle. What causes what to happen? For example, is TV bad for kids? But a good research question must be both precise and answerable. So, first off, what do we mean by kids? What age range are we talking about? And how about TV? How much television? And does it depend on what we're watching? Even the word is can be up for grabs. As in today, have the effects changed over time? And what do we mean by bad? For health, for grades and test scores, for happiness? The catch is that once we have an answer to a more precise question, it only raises more questions. So, if we conclude that yes, watching network TV for more than an hour a day lowers the grade point average of middle school students in the U.S. today, we may ask why? What would they be doing if they weren't watching TV? That is, how do we know that the observed association is causal and that, for example, poor grades are not driving kids to watch TV as solace? Do our findings extend to older students? Does TV affect IQ or just the ability to focus? And so on. As you can see, the process is never finished. This doesn't make research easy, so we as sociologists must try to inch our way slowly toward finding the answers, even if they only raise more questions. A social scientist's work is never done.
Sociologists follow the scientific method of gathering evidence, forming hypotheses and theories, a systematic schema, to explain it according to rules called research methods. The scientific method is a procedure involving the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses based on systematic observation, measurement, and/or experiments. A theory is an abstracted, systematic model of how some aspect of the world works. When we think about the scientific method, we also need to think too about causality. This is a central part of the scientific method, and it's the idea that a change in one factor results in a corresponding change in another factor. This also leads us to research methods. How do we use the scientific method? How do we take that scientific method and then be able to ask questions and formulate a study? This leads to research methods. Research methods are standard rules that social scientists follow when trying to establish a causal relationship between social elements. Quantitative methods seek to obtain information about the social world that we're in or can be converted to numeric form. Qualitative methods attempt to collect information about the social world that cannot be readily converted to numeric form. Therefore, it's often converted into narratives or stories that people share. So let's look at Research 101. We're going to look at the basics. Sociological research generally begins with a question that asks what causes a certain social phenomena to occur. Using a deductive approach to research, we start with a theory, develop a hypothesis, make empirical observations, and then analyze the data collected through observation to confirm, reject, or modify the original theory. Using an inductive approach to research, We start with the empirical observation and then work to form a theory. We then wanted to determine if a correlation exists by noticing if changes are observed in two things simultaneously. What we see here is the research cycle. In an inductive approach, again, we are going to be starting with the empirical observation, analyzing our observations, creating a theory, and then a hypothesis. In a deductive approach, we think of a theory first, then come up with a hypothesis, then do empirical observations, and finally analyze those empirical observations. Correlation exists when we simply observe changes in two things simultaneously. Often with correlation, we want to see if these two variables tend to track each other positively or negatively. Causality is the idea that a change in one factor results in a corresponding change in another factor. Causality exists when we can prove that a change in one factor does cause this change in the other factor. Remember that correlation doesn't mean causation. An example of correlation could be if we were going to be examining height and weight. We want to see if there is a positive connection between height and weight or a negative connection between height and weight, or no correlation or connection at all. Typically, when we think of this, we think of how taller people tend to be heavier simply based on their height. But that is not, in fact, always the case. So with correlation, we want to see if there's a connection. Causation would look at how there is cause and effect, that one thing leads to another. So maybe we want to examine, again, height and weight to examine, do taller people have more instances or increase in being overweight? It doesn't mean that being tall means that you're going to be overweight, but we want to see, does being taller lead to increased rates in overweight or obese individuals? Again, one doesn't necessarily mean the other, but we can show if there's a connection or if there is cause and effect. Sociologists conduct research to try to prove causation. In order to prove causation, researchers need to establish correlation in time order and rule out alternative explanations. A frequent issue in the problem of reverse causality, where the researcher believes that A results in change B, when in fact B is causing A, which is why time order is necessary to establish which is causing which. We also have variables. A dependent variable is the outcome that a researcher is trying to explain. An independent variable is a measure of factor that the researcher believes has a causal impact on the dependent variable. An example of the independent or IV and dependent or DV variables would be, again, if we were looking at height and weight. If we want to examine the rate of obesity in Americans, the rate of obese Americans would be the dependent variable, or the DV. When we think about the independent variables, or IV, we're going to look at height, we're going to look at socioeconomic status, we're going to look at geographical location, and we're going to look at level of education. Those things may impact why people may lead to why people are overweight or obese. So the dependent variable is the outcome, and it doesn't often change. The independent variables, or the IVs, they impact the DV and can impact what those outcomes are. In social research, a hypothesis is a proposed relationship between two variables. For hypotheses, there's both a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis that exists. When we think of the null and the alternative hypotheses, the alternative hypothesis is often going to be positive, and the null hypothesis is often going to be negative, null meaning none. This shapes the direction of the relationship, whether they are positive or negative. Operationalization is the process by which a researcher specifies the terms and methods they will use in a particular study and is an important aspect of hypothesis testing. An example that your book gives is how we can look at religiosity, or how religious someone is, could be operationalized as frequency of religious service attendance. So, what makes good research? Well, we often want to make sure that good research is valid, reliable, and generalizable. The measures that are used to evaluate must have, when we are evaluating the variables in a hypothesis, they have to have validity and reliability. Validity is, are you testing what you're supposed to be testing? Reliability looks at, now that we are testing, can this test be replicated? We also need to make sure that the outcomes of a particular study have generalizability to a larger population. So can the study be replicated with other groups? So again, validity is, are you testing what you're intending to test? Reliability says, can you replicate this test? Generalizability asks, can you replicate this with different groups or populations? Researchers must be aware of the effects that they have on people, relationships, and processes they are studying. These are called experimenter effects. And a way to counter them is to employ reflexivity and take these into account. So the white coat effect are those that researchers have on the very processes and relationships they are studying by virtue of being there. So in order to minimize this white coat effect, we typically will have some type of study that is called being blind, B-L-I-N-D. So you have a single blind study in which the researcher is unknown. A double-blind study means that the researchers and the participants don't know who each other is. Reflexivity means that you analyze and critically consider our own role and effect in our research. When we think of the role of the researcher, a lot of where we view our role comes from a feminist methodology. Feminist methodology treats women's experiences as legitimate, empirical, and theoretical resources. It promotes social science that may bring about policy change to help women, and is as conscious of the role of the researcher as that of the subjects being studied, as well as the power dynamics between them. So again, a lot of how we view ethics in research today is from this feminist methodology, in that we want to help promote some type of change within our society, but we also need to be conscious of our role as the researchers as well as the role of the participants. When we think about the types of data collection, our book covers several of them. This can include participant observations, interviews, surveys, historical methods, case studies, comparative research, experimental methods, and content analysis. Participant observation is a qualitative research method that seeks to uncover the meaning people give their social actions by observing their behavior and practice. Participant observation, you want to observe the people who are being a part of your study in their natural environments, or in as close to their natural environments as possible, to see how they behave. The ultimate goal of participant observation is to see people in practice without them recognizing that they are being observed. Interviews are another common form of gathering qualitative data. We can learn how and why people do things by asking them questions about it. Again, qualitative meaning that we are not focused on numbers like quantitative, but rather by the story or the narratives that people share. So in interviews, you typically have a standard set of interview questions, and then you ask the participants for their responses, and then you record their responses. Surveys are an ordered series of questions that are intended to elicit information from respondents. Most surveys are quantitative in nature. Think about a store or a restaurant you've been to. Target, CVS, Burger King, McDonald's, Popeyes. These are just a small subset of companies that typically ask for survey questions, either at the bottom of your receipt or on the back side of your receipt. Starbucks, if you have a registered account with them, will periodically send you emails asking for your feedback. So all of these companies, these stores and these fast food restaurants will typically ask you for how your experience was at a particular store during a particular time. You give your feedback and they give you an incentive. When they ask you for your feedback, they typically do it on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. They may ask you to fill in some information, but when you look at that scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, that's called a Likert scale, Likert. That's where they get that quantitative information. If they ask you for specific feedback in a box where you can type in information, that's the qualitative form. That's a form of an interview. When we look at historical methods, this is where we collect data from written reports, newspaper articles, journals, transcripts, television programs, diaries, artwork, and other artifacts that date back to the period under study. Using these historical methods, we then compile the information to show about a snapshot in a period of time that has passed. Comparative research is a form of research by which a researcher compares two or more entities with the intent of learning more about the factors that differ between them. So if we were looking at the civil rights movement versus the Black Lives Matter movement, comparative research would allow us to look at those two periods of time and examine what and how and who made these possible and how the larger society reacted to them as a result. This is an example here of historical analysis where we would look at this picture and we would be able to analyze socioeconomic status, race, depending on when this period of time was, financial situations, job opportunities, gender, etc. We would be able to look at this historical analysis and evaluate that period of time. Content analysis is a systematic analysis of the content rather than the structure of a communication, such as a written work, speech, or film. In content analysis, we take whatever is being analyzed, that specific content, and we look at the content of that film rather than the structure of the communication. So if we were looking at a particular film, for example, Shawshank Redemption, in looking at Shawshank Redemption, we would be able to analyze the content within the film, not necessarily how the film was produced or how it was filmed and the quality of the filmmaking. We want to look at the content of it itself. What were the meanings that were shared? How did this reflect what was happening during the time period in which it was filmed? How accurate was it? What does that do for our understanding of a larger historical situation? Finally, we have experimental methods. They seek to alter the social landscape in a very specific way for a given sample of individuals and then track what results that change yields. So an experimental method could be looking at, first of all, in experimental methods, you typically have two groups. you have the experimental group and you have the control group. So if we were looking at education and we wanted to examine the impact that free books versus charging for textbooks, how does that impact one's educational outcomes? The control group would be given books that they had to pay for, which is the typical standard in most colleges. The experimental group would be given their textbooks for free. We would then follow the students throughout the semester, which, because we're looking at them over a period of time, that is considered a longitudinal study. But we would follow them over this period of time and then look at their grades as a marker for seeing, does paying for textbooks or does receiving your textbooks or does the cost of textbooks impact the educational outcomes? Based on the grades that the students received, we would look at the students in the control group who had to pay for their textbooks versus the experimental group, and looking at those students who got their books for free to see who had higher grade point averages over the course of the semester. Did the assignments that were specific to the book make a difference based on whether they had to pay for it or not? Let's briefly talk about some ethics of social research. Researchers must meet codified standards, which are often set by professional associations, academic institutions, or research centers when conducting studies. Researchers must guard against causing physical, emotional, or psychological harm to their subjects. By adhering to informed consent and voluntary participation guidelines, researchers can make sure that their subjects know they're participating in a study and have voluntarily chosen to participate. So, when we think about informed consent is both written and oral, and it outlines who the researcher is, what's the title of the study, what the purpose of the study, what is the, as a participant, understanding that it's voluntary, that you can quit at any time. If you are able to receive some type of incentive, like the opportunity to get a gift card or money for participating, that has to be outlined. If there's any concerns, who can you contact at the institution that is running the study, as well as if it can bring up any form of harm. What can you do if anything arises? And finally, acknowledging your participation and that you understand the informed consent and the voluntary participation. Public sociology refers to the practice of using sociological research, teaching, and service to reach a wider and not solely academic audience and to influence society. So when we think about research, understand that in many cases, we try to go outside of that institution into public. And by going into the public, you are able to get a broader scope of what is occurring at that period of time. I hope that this was helpful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.